In this screencast, I'm going to explain how to rip a CD using wax. I will deal with a relatively straightforward case so that I have an opportunity to explain the features of wax that support ripping. In subsequent screencasts, I will deal with more complicated cases, such as creating multiple recordings from a single CD or creating one recording from multiple CDs. The first step in ripping a CD is to insert the CD into the optical disk drive in the wax box. After you have inserted the CD, go to Edit mode and select the appropriate genre for the CD that you're ripping. Next, press the Read CD button. Wax presents a list of the tracks on the CD and gives you an opportunity to initiate the rip operation itself. In general, you want to start the rip operation immediately because it takes time, so you can better utilize your time by starting the rip while you attend to metadata. Notice that when you press the Read CD button, wax also went out over the internet to obtain as much metadata as it could find related to the recording. When wax finds metadata at the database MusicBrainz, it uses it to populate the metadata fields on the left side of the screen. In this case, the metadata that wax found was sufficient to fill in all of the fields for the work metadata, also to provide names or titles for all of the tracks, and finally to provide cover art. So in fact, at this point we have all of the metadata that we need to create the recording, which means that we can go ahead and click the Save button to actually effect that operation. Now at this point you're done. Aside from having to wait until the rip operation completes, we can confirm that the recording has been created by returning to select mode and observing that the recording is present and it's automatically selected, which means that it's playable, so that's why the play button appeared. You can click the play button now, in fact, even though the rip operation is still underway. But in general, you want to be sure that at least one track is completely ripped before you push the play button. Now that we have successfully created our first recording, I'd like to go back and repeat all of the steps more slowly so that I can make more comments about the operations. The first step after selecting the genre was to click the Read CD button. Recall that wax presented a list of all of the tracks on the CD, permitting us to specify which would be ripped. Notice that the tracks are rendered in gray. When the track is rendered in gray, that indicates that it has not been ripped. When the track has been ripped, the font will be white. The boxes on the left indicate which tracks will be ripped. By default, wax selects for ripping all tracks that have not been ripped. There may be a situation in which you know in advance that you're not interested in ripping certain tracks. In that case, simply unselect them by clicking on the checkbox. In order to activate Start, at least one of these checkboxes needs to be checked. Normally, the Rip checkbox will be checked, but you might also want to check the Play box. When you do this, you'll be able to listen to the CD at the same time that it's ripping. It's also possible to check only the Play box for those situations in which you want to listen to the CD immediately and you're not interested in ripping it into your collection. When the rip operation finishes, normally wax will eject the CD automatically. That behavior can be controlled in config mode on the params page under parameters, where you can see the option eject when ripping done. Normally this option will be selected, but if it is not selected, then when ripping finishes, you will need to eject the CD manually using this button. And while we're talking about config mode, I should also mention that config mode is where you go to select the encoder that you want to use when you rip the CD. The options appear under the encoder option on the same page that we just looked at. You have a choice of 5 encoders: WAVE, FLAC, OGG, AAC, and MP3. My personal preference is OGG, but yours may be different. The other thing that happened when you press the Read CD button is that WAX sent queries to 2 databases accessible over the internet. When WAX finds metadata at the MusicBrainz database, it uses it immediately to fill in the metadata fields on the left. If metadata is not available in MusicBrainz, it's possible that you might be able to use metadata from the backup database, which is FreeDB. As you can see from this comment, this recording had metadata available at both databases. Let's suppose, however, that the metadata was not available at the MusicBrainz database, in which case these fields would be empty. FreeDB typically has more than one entry for a recording, and the quality of the entries varies significantly. Therefore, we need to examine the metadata to select the version that is closest to what we desire to have for our catalog. To examine the raw metadata that WAX downloaded from the 2 internet databases, we can drag this separator upward to expose more of the panel underneath, which contains the raw metadata. If I scroll up to the top, you can see the metadata that it obtained from MusicBrainz, and following that we can see 3 versions of metadata available at FreeDB. When you find a version of the metadata from FreeDB that you like, you can click the accompanying button to have it transferred into the fields on the left. This version of the metadata was actually a poor choice because we don't like that the album title also contains the date. If we scroll up to the second version, we obtain work metadata that looks fine, but the track metadata contains the artist as well as the track title. If we continue up to the first version, we see that the track metadata is now acceptable, and so is the work metadata. So in a situation where metadata was not available from MusicBrainz, we would have been satisfied to use the first version available from FreeDB. There are several ways to transfer metadata from the raw metadata panel on the right to the metadata fields on the left. Whether WAX transfers metadata automatically in the case of MusicBrainz or at the push of a button in the case of FreeDB, it employs an algorithm to examine the raw metadata and attempt to extract the metadata that it actually wants. Those algorithms sometimes break down because of variations in the formatting of the raw metadata. Let's suppose that we have a situation in which WAX was unable to find metadata to fill this field, the group metadata field. Another way in which we could easily transfer metadata from the raw metadata panel to the group field would be to select it using our mouse. I'm going to sweep out in a sloppy manner the two words that I want to transfer to the group metadata field. And when I release the button on the mouse, Wax automatically broadens the selection to encompass exactly those two words. And now I can simply drag this metadata over to the group field and drop it, and Wax does the appropriate thing. Another possibility would be to use cut and paste. So for example, I could select the name again. I can use Control-C to copy it, and then come over here and use Control-V to paste it. So there are two other ways in which metadata can be transferred to the fields on the left. And obviously, a final possibility when all else fails is simply to type the information in using the keyboard. You probably noticed that the metadata fields on the left come in pairs. The reason for that is that the first entry in each pair is for the full version of the metadata, which appears in play mode, and the second entry is used for the short version of the metadata, which appears in select mode. Wax has algorithms for computing the short form from the long form, and the algorithms vary depending on the genre. In the case of pop music, Wax simply copies the long form to the short form, so whatever I type here appears in the short form. In other genres, the algorithm is different. For example, in classical genres, you might have a metadata field for the name of the composer, and typically you would configure that field so that the short form is derived from the long form by taking the last name only. The width of the entry for the short form corresponds to the width of the column in select mode, so you get immediate feedback as to whether the short form will be visible in select mode. You may encounter a situation where you need to enter more than one name. It's hard to imagine that situation occurring in the case of pop music, where the first field is the name of the group. But if we suppose that there were two groups involved, then you could click on that right arrow to open up another pair of fields where you could put the name of the second group. Another situation that might arise is that you want to include additional metadata. In that case, you would use the plus meta button to open another metadata field. Give it an appropriate name, and then enter a value for that metadata field. Tracks can also have metadata associated with them. Simply select the track and notice that the plus meta button became sensitive when I did that. If I click it, then we have a similar situation that we just saw for work metadata, where there's a field for the key, which might be the composer of the song, and then you would put the composer's name here. And if you have other information you'd like to include, possibly a guest artist who sings only on this track, you can click plus meta again to get yet another field. The checkboxes on the left are used to designate which tracks will be saved in the recording. In the pop genre, and most genres for that matter, you'll typically want to save all of the tracks, but there may be a situation where you know for sure that you don't want to save some of the tracks, in which case you could simply unselect them. A more common use for saving a subset of the tracks occurs in a situation that we'll discuss in a subsequent screencast, where you're creating multiple recordings from a single CD. The graphic on the right is used to specify a segue. If you click it, then this track will segue directly to the track following it. That is, it plays without the usual gap between the tracks. Another way to set the segue flag is to using a keyboard shortcut is to type Control S. And the keyboard shortcut is particularly handy in a situation where you want all of the tracks to have a segue, because then you can just select all of the tracks and type Control S, and all of the segue flags are set at the same time. I will describe the group and plus tracks buttons in a subsequent screencast. The next screencast will describe how to create multiple recordings from a single CD. See you there.